The world is changing, and we need to find new ways to change with it. The world of work, the way that we're building businesses, the way that we're picking up new skills, how we're trying to adapt ourselves for an uncertain future, where we're going. All of these things are changing before our eyes in an exponential way. And so today on The Humble Pie, I'm going to share with you a little bit of my thoughts on where things are going, how we can understand the problem properly, exactly what's at the core of it before we go about proposing a solution, as well as what I think the solution could be, and why it all starts with keeping an open and a humble mind and an open heart to create a new, more curious, more bold, and certainly a more prepared version of yourself as we go into this crazy future in front of us. All that to come on The Humble Pie. Thanks so much for jumping in to The Humble Pie. I appreciate it, as always. I've been busy, as we all have been, I'm sure. It seems to be a normal trend these days of just being exceptionally rammed in terms of time. But I'm excited to share some of the thinking that I've been doing over the last couple of weeks for a new project that I've started. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. But first, I wanted to kind of jump right in and talk about what this future looked like and what we can do about it, and asking the right kinds of questions when it comes to doing that. Now, as often happens when you want to understand the future and when you want to make more sense of what's coming at you, it normally is a good idea to look at what happened in the past. As often people like to say, history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And if we look back at history, whether it's 10 years ago or 2,000 years ago, there's always something new to learn. There's always some kind of pattern to spot or question we could be asking based on what we've seen before. So before we go forward, I want to go back. And if we go back to, let's say, 2,000 years ago, it's quite a while, 20 centuries ago, to first century Rome. Now, if you picture yourself there in the middle of Italy, on the Italian coast in Rome, without any luck, maybe you weren't a slave, which means that you might have had some land allocated to you or somewhere to stay that was yours for you and your family. Perhaps you were even paid a salary by the state. This would have been especially true if you had served in the army. You paid taxes, things worked, the water ran, there was sanitation, there was guidelines on how high you could build your block of flats in the Roman times. There was an unusual sense of sophistication during that time, first century Rome, and that was when the empire itself was at its height. It was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and this lasted about 200 years, or just over 200 years, which was pretty incredible when you think about it, because the previous 6 centuries before that had been a constant battle, either with barbarians, trying to squeeze their way in and push the borders from the outside, or there were civil wars, constant infighting and squabbling amongst the Romans themselves internally. So to have this particular time, which was, if you like, for better or for worse, to use the word peace, was pretty incredible. And for the moment at that time, it seemed as though there was nothing that could top the greatest empire that the world had ever seen. I've just finished reading this incredibly cool. Yeah, I suppose I say the word cool because I'm a nerd, but an incredible book by a woman called Susan Wise Bauer called The History of the Ancient World, which takes you through kind of 3,000 or 4,000 years of ancient civilizations and the rise and falls of kingdoms and empires, right from the Sumerians right through to the Roman times. And it's so interesting to see the same kinds of patterns play out. You start as a tribe, you win some wars, you get a couple people on your side, you develop an army, you have a couple sons, and you pass over what you have to them, and that grows into a kingdom and eventually an empire. And so that's happened again and again and again. It's the story of our existence. And so when you look at Rome, there was nothing that could top the greatest empire that the world had seen up until that point. It also meant that problems that might have plagued other empires, other kingdoms, were now mostly solved. There was, this period of peace. The rule of law seemed to mostly work. And then we get to a very interesting time in the first century where the Emperor Nero succeeds the throne, or at least becomes the princeps, which in that time was the name for the Caesar, the emperor. Now, Nero himself wasn't really a good steward of affairs of the state, and he seemed to be a tyrant and a depraved, despicable autocrat. Sometimes it seems that those terms just go together these days. And on top of that, Nero killed his own mother. He overruled the Senate all the time. He made reckless decisions about maintaining the empire. And all of that was true before what he's perhaps most famously known for, which is the Great Fire of Rome. Now, it's not really known. There's a couple different disputed sources to this, but it's not really known whether he started this by accident or perhaps whether it was started by accident or perhaps it was, something to do with Nero or perhaps some conspirators, who knows how it started. But as we all know, the legend, the famous images, the famous poetry and literature that's been made of it for thousands of years, literally, after that, he strummed his fiddle or he was playing his violin softly to himself while watching the flames of the great city of Rome engulf everything from afar, from the safety of his palace or wherever he was standing. For over a week, these fires burned. And even though the city recovered and Rome still continued for another 300 years, it did eventually break apart. It split in two, or in different sort of quadrants of the empire, and then that eventually gave way to what became the Byzantine Empire. And so what was once mighty and unstoppable eventually became something that decayed and rotted just like the rest of them. Now, I bring this up, and that doesn't really have anything to do with Nero, because Nero himself didn't cause the collapse of Rome. But there is something incredibly, it stays in the imagination of the human imagination, the image of him watching his own capital city going down and raging in flames, and how this has left such a strong mark, an indelible mark on our collective human memory. The reminder, or this image of someone standing by idly as the world around them falls apart. Now, this for me is the kind of the image that I want to start with, where, we have these times of comparable peace and stability, what seems like stability, and then you get somebody or a force or something that comes along and shows us just how disconnected we really are. So this whole story about Nero is really about, a kind of a cautionary tale about that disconnection and the bad things that can silently happen when nobody's looking, because they think that they don't have to be looking. And so with that in mind, and the way that we are as a species, it makes me wonder, in the near future that's ahead of us, with all of this change and all of this talk of radical kind of futuristic change that's going to be coming our way, who do we become? Who are we? And where do we go as humans? How do we maintain our position on the planet? And how can we continue to be useful, not just to ourselves and to the environment, but for future generations? Where do we go? Now, we can't talk seriously about our behavior and the impact on the future without accepting what that future is very likely going to look like. And in it, it's indisputable that it will, more and more become integrated with smart technologies, with automation and artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence has stolen the headlines. As we all know, everyone has become a ChatGPT guru overnight almost. And it's kind of given us, aside from the practical value that something like ChatGPT can give us, it's definitely given us an interesting window into the next version of ourselves, where we're starting to augment and integrate ourselves more and more with artificial intelligence, whether it might be our businesses or our processes at first. Eventually, these things will become part of us and part of what we do, and also part of helping us to solve the most difficult problems that we have on our planet right now, and the kinds of crises that we will need to face, mostly because we are the ones who created these crises. Now, when it comes to technology, I just want to clarify, I am a big bull. I am very much into technology, and I can also see so much of the impressive and meaningful work that technology and systems and smart thinking and really, really kind of future-focused products that have been developed all over the world. And they make a difference, and it's important to acknowledge and celebrate the good that technology brings us. And there's no doubt that we're going to be leaning in and leaning on AI and smart technologies and frameworks more and more, because it's going to more and more be doing the work for us. And when you compare what AI and all these technologies can do for us, it's clear who the winner is when it comes to speed, efficiency, accuracy. Certainly doing things at a much lower or sometimes even zero cost than ever before, when we had to get a human to do it. So thanks to ChatGPT, we're now happy to crucify copywriters in record numbers. That's just a little Roman joke. But still, these kinds of things are going to happen, because the more that we embrace exponential change that's driven by technology, the more that we also have to realize that there's a price, or that there's another aspect to that, which may be not necessarily negative for anybody else, but certainly negative for us and the way that we want to do things and the way that we want to maintain order and our own livelihoods as humans on this planet right now. But that's not how progress works. And so this is why this is an important question to think about. Now, my interest isn't really so much about how the world will change due to AI and exponential technologies, even though that is interesting, but rather specifically for this podcast, how humans will change and how we will be thinking about these kinds of questions, and ultimately how we can inspire people to understand and to support the important initiatives that are going on, certainly on our planet right now. If you look at environmental challenges that we all face, even though it feels like maybe only some of us face it, we do have that selective ignorance that, makes us think that, biodiversity or pollution or these kinds of, massive challenges only kind of impact some people in some parts of the planet. And certainly at an economic level, that might be true. But the problem is that they really impact all of us. And that's the important first premise that we all have to buy into. Now, what's interesting about technology and the impact that it has on how we make sense of the world is that we tell a story normally around innovation or great sort of technological leaps. The first is that, we let the clever people do the work, the scientists, the guys who, created the rockets to go to the moon and launch the astronauts into orbit. And we let them do that because they look like they know what they're doing. And a lot of the time they do. And ultimately, they let the software and the systems and the machines do the work because it knows what it's doing. And so there's a covenant there. We trust that. We understand that these are the systems, these are the way that things work. And so what happens over time is that because that's the story we tell and that's what we accept, despite every good intention, a distance begins to emerge between us and the problem that we help to create. You see, we don't fix these problems, but rather we find really smart ways of innovating ourselves out of the problem. There's a really important and quite a revealing distinction there to make, because we rather let the machines do the work because the work is hard. And often the work is not necessarily cleaning up the ocean or, combating poverty or looking at inequality, because the real work to do there is not just issuing more food stamps or creating more government debt, but it requires us to do work on a level where we have to ask ourselves very, very, very difficult questions. And as humans, we are experts at denial. And so that means that we would rather stick our heads in the sand, as other mammals do, and rather let the machines do the work, or rather be comforted by the thought that the machine is doing the work for us. And so as a result, our bubble, the world that we live in, becomes comfortable, becomes automated, becomes convenient, becomes siloed from reality. The bubble closes in because there's more important things going on my iPhone rather than anything else that's over there. It's in the distance. No matter what might be happening, if it's the environment in peril, or if there's a great political collapse, it's easier to rather just focus on how I'm being distracted in the palm of my hand right here, because it's got my attention. And so if it's not interrupting my attention with something else, I'm just going to keep my attention here. And so what happens is that the interest that we have, or the interest that perhaps we had in other major crises and things that we need to solve collectively as a human race, that interest gets replaced by apathy, by the kinds of things that now maybe just matter less because we've chosen to deprioritize that. So why I'm mentioning all this is because in the age of sort of automation and all of these things that are not going to become clearer necessarily as the future approaches us, but has a very strong chance of becoming less clear, we forget the essence of what it means to be human. And that kind of comes back to the image of Nero, the image of disconnection. You can watch it burning right in front of you, yet you can have no reaction. And so the essence of being able to reestablish that is down to connection, about what it means to collectively organize strength in numbers, to use our imagination, to connect with each other, because that's what brought us where we are today. We needed to organize ourselves in larger groups to collaborate, to communicate, and to connect with each other in order to emerge from the caves, in order to create, kingdoms from tribes, and ultimately peace and democracy, whichever way you might want to look at that, from barbarism. And so these are the things that have carried us, but now we stand at a time where it's possible that we could start losing those things. So we need to be aware of this, not only as we define the future for ourselves, but also as we shape the world for what we're going to be leaving behind for future generations. So now, what do we do? How can we as sort of collective humans continue to play a role, and a role that matters? So for me, it starts with redefining the story that we tell of our own role on the planet. So like I said earlier, we let the smart guys do the work, the smart guys let the machines do the work, and we're happy with the distance that emerges from that. But the story needs to change, and we need to change it based on how we can work together, how we can communicate, and how we can motivate action. Because ultimately these problems and these things that we need to address that go from annoying to outright existential threats require action to solve them. So I've been thinking about two sort of big questions with this in mind. The first is, what are those innately human skills, those abilities, those things that we do only as humans uniquely that allow us to stay connected to each other and to the planet? What are those methods of connecting that make a difference, especially during times of difficulty? And the second thing is, how can those skills, those interaction skills and abilities, how can they help us to motivate action and positive behavior in the future? Now, these aren't easy questions, but as someone who builds businesses for a living, as someone who takes an interest in telling stories and being creative, as someone who likes to build communities, I'm always looking into different sort of trends and formats and the kinds of things that bring people together and gravitate them towards a cause that they can care about. Because when we all rally around something we care about, it's much easier for us to actually act on those feelings and on the conviction we feel. So I've found that there are a couple of conditions that can bring about these sort of connecting points with each other and how we build these skills, which I'm going to share with you now. Because they're not only interesting because they work, but also because when it comes to right down to how startups and innovative founders in whatever space they're in, I think that these can be extremely powerful and useful tools in your toolkit when you're making an impact, when you're developing a new product, when you're building an audience with the future in mind, with the future that we all share. Because ultimately, anything that you do, whether it's a product or a service, you're helping somebody to do something. And you're helping them to normally solve a problem, which is often what I like to talk about. And there can be no greater problem that we face collectively that everyone faces. You've got a target market of the entire population of the planet. There can be no greater problem than the problem of losing connection with each other. Because as soon as we lose connection with each other and we become more comfortable in our bubbles, it means that we're going to collaborate less. It means that things start to decay. And it means that the flames of the city are going to burn while we all watch dispassionately and from a distance. So I don't want to be all doomsday about it. And in fact, the things that I've learned and what I'm about to share with you, these conditions, really do help to turn the tide around what's possible. But it is important to understand also the potential cost, the toll of not getting this right? So when it comes to these three sort of conditions to enable human connection and the kinds of bonds that allow people to take action and motivate them to shift their behavior, it all starts with learning. It all starts with being able to understand knowledge, to integrate it into your system, and to do something with it. Now, when it comes to learning, I don't just mean it in the parrot fashion kind of school sense, which I'm sure we could dedicate many podcast episodes to on how the schooling system potentially failed many people. But so it's not just learning in that sense, but rather how can you create the kinds of conditions for people to broaden their perspective, to connect with each other and help them to help themselves, to help them to develop the kinds of functional interpersonal skills that they're going to be using to then attack these problems with. So whether you're a environmental warrior and you're trying to clean up the oceans, or you're keen to apply this in your company, or you're creating a new marketing plan, maybe you're creating a pitch deck for investors. This is something I've been doing recently. Or perhaps you're just writing copy for a new website or a campaign to educate customers. All of these things I think will help you just set the right frame of mind. So these three conditions are the following. The first is the magic of what happens in micro communities. The second is the power of learning by doing. And the third is the space for validating new ideas. Now, as I said in the beginning, the world is changing and we absolutely must find new ways to change with it. The way to build a sustained audience over time in a kind of a business or a kind of a scaling sense is to recognize their humanity, to help them as people rather than as members of an audience or see them as a big blob. And not just to help them solve problems, but to equip them with the ability and skills to solve problems for themselves in the future. And the way you do that is by helping them build skills. It's as simple as that. And the future we're looking at now, I think it's my very strong contention that the skills that people need to sort of really double down on are those human skills, those interaction skills. These are decision-making, empathy, the ability to ask the right questions, the ability to listen properly, using their creativity, understanding their own intuition, understanding context, being able to tell stories, thinking in exponential terms, in step change terms, how to solve problems creatively, how to communicate, and how to lead other people with compassion. So these are all kind of skills and areas that everyone sort of understands and has a general idea of how to get better at. But often it's really important to invest time to really understand how they work and what are the mechanisms, what are the things that separates, for example, a problem solver who can solve problems ordinarily versus a exceptional problem solver or an exceptional communicator. What are those things? Because there really are mechanisms and certain things at work that can be learned and that can be practiced. And that's the key here. So when we're creating a space for others to extend their human connection abilities and enable them to see and to respond to changes coming their way, you're giving them the ultimate boost. You're giving them the ultimate value add. And of course, as a business in building an audience, it can be the boldest and the most incredible branding exercise, if you want to think about it like that as well. So I've been putting these three elements into practice, which we're about to jump into right now, as part of a new community building and human skills development business I've started. It's called Humble Mind. So far, the feedback and the results that I've been seeing from The learning groups that we've arranged and started to run has been amazing, which has been the greatest, most beautiful validation that this is a good idea and that there's a demand for it. And I'm going to kind of talk through these three elements that really are the foundations of why something like Humble Mind exists and why I think it's something that everybody should pay attention to. Okay, so the first is about micro communities and why micro communities. So it's important to first sort of define what we're talking about here. So a micro community is normally a small group of people. Now, of course, this use of the word small is completely relative. It could be 10 people. It could be 5 people even. It could be up to 150 people. The key, though, and why it is a micro community, is that there are particularly strong interests and objectives that are shared between everyone in the community. There's a strong overlap. So you might have a community of people, for example, that might read Deepak Chopra books, or enjoy watching Oprah, or whatever it might be. But they're not necessarily a strongly bonded community or a micro community because, firstly, it's a massive number. There might be millions and millions of people who watch and enjoy Oprah's show or Deepak's books. But aside from the fact that they all are, watching and consuming their content, there might not be very much else that overlaps between these people. That's why when I work with startups and founders and business owners, I always try and encourage them to think about their audience as a person with multiple different interests, but still an individual. It's easy to think that your audience is this big faceless kind of blob, an amalgamation of various different statistics, but that's not how it works because that's not how they experience you. So normally a micro community for what we're talking about here is a community that has a number of different overlapping interests that make them more alike or share their particular interests or objectives more closely than something that you might find in a bigger community. Now, why a micro community approach to building an audience and to thinking about how to shift some of the questions we've talked about is because there's a really important trend that is really, really key to pay attention to. And that's that everyday life, we're caught between different polarities, polar opposite forces. If you think about it, we're hyper-connected to everything and everybody all the time. But at the same time, we're distracted, we're overwhelmed, we're disconnected from each other. We're definitely more prosperous than in any time in history, but we're completely unfulfilled. We're not happy. The less, or rather, we have an abundance of choice, the different things that we can choose to do or to buy at any time, but we don't always have much purpose. The more convenient life gets, the happy or less happy we are. The closer the future comes, the more uncertain it seems. So because of all of these forces, which I think almost anybody can relate to, these sorts of things have a massive destabilizing effect on the way that large numbers of people create and maintain order, in the way that communities, in a more traditional sense, hold their structure. Because new forces will always threaten the old ways of thinking. This is just what happens all across human history. So in the face of uncertainty and in the face of more difficult things that threaten to take away the overlapping interests between people in a community, what happens almost always is that bigger communities splinter. They splinter into smaller ones. Why? Well, because smaller communities have less people, which means it's easier to stick together because there's more common ground between less people, especially if they came from a larger community where there was maybe less common ground. Now, this reflects, I think, an important sort of trend that we're seeing, how, specifically internet communities are becoming smaller and more concentrated and more niche. If you think about it, this is a massive power shift away from big numbers with surface level impact or attraction to smaller numbers with big impact. And that's the key. That is the key. The smaller the amount of people, or rather the more concentrated the amount of people, the greater and the more valuable the interaction or the depth of the networking or the bond that happens and that develops between them. So why does this matter? Well, the story you tell, the newsletter that you might send out, the product that you develop, all of this has to take this into account. focusing on your audience as a smaller audience with more concentrated interests or things that hold them together help you to create a much more resonant message. And the intention, all of that stays local. It gets a chance to stay specific to them, which is essential if you're not just wanting to inform them about things, but to motivate them to do things, to get out there and shift a behavior, to change the way that they might treat the environment, or to help them reassess certain important questions in their life. It doesn't mean that you need to, just once again, I don't want you to think that with micro communities, it means a small amount of people. And, what the hell, Alex? I deal with an addressable market of 20,000 people. How am I going to do that? No. Don't think about it as a small audience and that you only have to focus on a small amount of them. Rather, it's about how you segment and approach your total audience so that you think of them in a range of different tiers. What holds my different tiers of audiences together? What are those commonalities, the things that they are more likely to share in common because there is a smaller group? What is more likely to be relevant to them? When you crack that, the longer they'll end up staying together. So I ran a trial for Humble Mind in May last month, and I focused on a small learning group of just 12 people, and we met every Wednesday for 90 minutes, which has now become the staple of the theme. The learning theme that I chose for the trial group was human skills in the age of AI. And what was amazing to see was dealing with a smaller group, or rather a group that had more concentrated interests, allowed the atmosphere of this kind of close-knit group, this environment that allowed people to not just engage with the subject, but with each other. There was something that emerged, especially once we did it week on week, and the bonds of familiarity started to, the group became more familiar unto itself. These things started to emerge out of nowhere, which surprised me, but also surprised me at how much this emerged. People started connecting with each other on LinkedIn. They started to kind of get in touch to discuss new opportunities. They began to network with each other with no help from me. I didn't do anything. It was just about breaking the ice, bringing them together on a particular issue or a topic that they all cared about, and the rest of the connection did the work between them. And that was beautiful to see. And that's definitely why Humble Mind has the magic of micro communities as one of its pillars. So let's move on to the second one. Because now that you've got a community of dedicated people, you've sort of ring-fenced a bunch of interests that will apply to them to keep them together. You now need to give them something to do or to be in order for that to stick around, for that kind of community element to be preserved and its purpose. And that's why we come to this second element, which is the power of learning by doing. Now, I don't know about you, but when I learn something, obviously we're all different kinds of learners, and it's been fascinating to understand how people learn and the world of sort of learning. We all learn differently. Sometimes learners are visual. Sometimes you're, more hands-on or kinesthetic, as they call it. Sometimes you're auditory. You enjoy listening to podcasts like this, or perhaps listening to videos or chats. And sometimes people need to learn by speaking or by practicing what they're applying and what they're doing in real time. And in a sense, I found that no matter what kind of learner you are, or what kind of material you enjoy learning from, whether it's videos or reading or whatever the case may be, everyone benefits from this particular style of learning, especially when it comes, interestingly, to developing these interaction skills. Because interaction skills, the kinds of soft skills, if you like, are the kinds of things that work best from practice. And because they're interpersonal skills by nature, you can only practice them with somebody else. And so this sort of phenomenon of understanding the best way to unleash how people develop those skills, as well as learning by doing and learning by actively engaging what you've learned and teaching it to somebody else, or explaining it or interacting with it with a group or with another person, is the crucial element here. Now, when we contribute something new, or when we learn, or when we create something, it works because I think one of the greatest elements of learning is the social aspect. You're taking part in a social activity, which means that when you're learning something or creating something, you're doing it as part of a group, and there's a fair amount of interaction on various different points, some of them obvious, some of them quite subtle. So, for example, if you're on a webinar, or when you're learning on an online course, you're passive, you're comfortable, with being on mute. You're listening in, maybe you're taking some notes, but let's face it, everybody's got another 3 or 4 tabs open, busy finishing emails, reading an ebook, checking the news, doing other things, because you're not in an environment where you're going to be actively contributing. And the problem with that is that when you're not actively contributing, the retention of what you're learning or the knowledge areas don't stick around for as long, because your concentration and your attention is not there. However, when you're inviting others to actively go off mute, take part, what do you think? What is the particular view that you have on this? Talk about it and get challenged by it from other members in the community or other members in that group. And then you're also doing that week on week, you're doing that regularly, there's something incredible that happens to the value that's created for everybody, not just you, but for everyone. Now, this sort of learn by doing element in the way that I've just described is essential in the way that Humble Mind works, because within the community, if you're part of a community, your voice matters. As an individual, you're only as strong as the individual voices that hold it together. And that's why communities are so special. And in a micro-community environment, it's even more amplified. So your experience, your perspective, your set of skills, the abilities that help you to see a particular subject or a problem or shed light on a topic that maybe someone else has not quite considered before in that way, that's the insight. That's the amazing insight that no one has been able to extract or hear before that very moment, before it was extracted there and somebody asked the question, you provided an answer, and now everybody's thinking in a new way. And that only happens in this kind of environment where there's a social kind of lubrication in a way, in the way that people are learning by doing, they're throwing different kind of ideas out, they're, sort of maybe defending the position, they're debating it, they're problem solving together. And ultimately what happens is that you create new knowledge. And that's unbelievably exciting for me as a way that you get to bring people together and get them to think and get them to challenge a lot of the time not just each other's beliefs but their own beliefs. And that's what we did in the Humble Mind sessions. So as a business, as a startup, whatever you do, think about the kinds of journeys and the kinds of content that you're going to be creating for your audiences. If you're doing that, make sure that you're involving them actively as well. So this means sort of maybe considering to spend less time on more passive forms of learning, like ebooks and courses and articles, even those that, those definitely have an important role to play. But there's so much that you might be missing out on if you're not actively inviting them in real time for feedback and contribution to a topic or idea or a question. It might be a roundtable or a podcast, maybe a showcase event or a webinar. There's so many different ways to do it. But when you invite feedback and you invite that person's unique perspective as part of the learning process, as part of the skills building process, there's something incredible that starts to happen. Not only do they show up, but these people actually have their time to shine in the sun, and they learn new things, and they learn because they're doing it by doing. They're learning by doing. All right, and now this brings me to the third element of how all this works, which is being able to create the space for validating new ideas. Now, once you have a community that's based on those strong common grounds and also having a culture of active participation where people are actively learning and interacting with each other, you then create the right conditions for this third element, which I think in the long run is the most important one. And that's the space for new ideas. Now, when you think about new ideas, here's the thing. Now, for a new idea to sprout, it normally comes after there has been about 20 or 30 or 50 bad ones, right? Now, this is especially true when it comes to innovation, how people create new products. These things only thrive when new ideas are shared, they're tested, they're debated, and they're rejected. And there's a rhythm and a kind of a ritual that goes into not criticizing the ideas directly or the person behind the idea, but being able to have a high standard of how these ideas are refined and kind of interacted with. The only way that happens is that when people feel that the environment around them encourages them to experiment, to have dialogue, to collaborate, where these new ideas can be evaluated without judgment, but also rigorously and refined. Because the only way to do that is to kind of have a mentality of treating the ideas, as valid only unto themselves. And that's also how we begin to get to the new ideas, right? And by creating the space for sort of validating these ideas, we ensure that the connection with the problems that we face remains strong, right? We're not becoming like Nero, where we're disconnected, but we're aware of the problem that this idea is, nobly but perhaps, ineffectively trying to solve, trying to address. And our efforts are all then focused on trying to refine that idea to push it closer to solving that problem. If it can't be something that can be, a solution for that problem, we move on to the next idea. And that's how we begin to create some kind of change. Now, in Humble Mind, this kind of idea validation space emerges a little bit, after some time, after people know each other and, they're part of the learning group. They spend time learning new things on a subject and they practice their interaction skills, on each other. And then they begin to trust each other. And because of that trust, they share an idea for a new startup they might have, or a question that they'd like to have help with. Or perhaps they coach someone else on how they could be running their team better based on an experience that they themselves have had. Or they put them in touch with someone who they know can assist with building a new website or building a new product category. So from these bonds, this amazing sense of trust amongst, what would otherwise be complete strangers, the trust to work, to collaborate, to test things together, because there's no judgment, there's no ego based on who's got a bad idea and who doesn't. It's about evaluating the idea on the strength of its premise and what it's trying to solve. And that's the only way we get to good ideas, to the kinds of ideas that can help us solve real problems. We have to get through the bad ones first. And that only happens when you test it out, you throw it out, and see what comes back from the group, because someone from that group may just have a way to help and to turn it into an even better idea. So this is where we kind of come back to full circle to Nero and Rome. So Nero and his downfall was all about the disconnect that he had with his city and the people that he ruled, the subjects and the problems that it faced. Even, if you think about it, it even got to the point where the city was burning in front of him, and yet there was no reaction, or at least in the way that we remember the story. Now, if you fast forward 2,000 years into our exponentially advancing world, it's also easy for us to become completely disconnected from the issues that we quite urgently need to address. But we also have to find new ways of not only learning and building skills, but also overcoming that sense of denial, that inbuilt denial and that inbuilt sort of inability to sometimes rise to what's actually needed. And the only way to do that is by focusing on learning, in my mind. By focusing on learning, recapturing the attention that people have around a particular issue or a challenge that we solve. And then you incorporate these three elements that we've talked about, handling them as part of a micro-community for a more intimate and focused connection, building the bond between them, being able to have a message or have a cause that unites them and really sort of inspires action amongst them. Then we get to learning by doing, which is a really powerful approach to encourage that active participation, that engagement. It goes beyond passive forms of learning and invites someone to contribute their unique perspective, to get involved with the subject material and add their unique part to it or their unique insight to it, because that's really where new knowledge comes from, right? And finally, once we have these two conditions, we then create the space necessary for idea validation, for soundboarding, for being able to foster the kinds of things that innovation and growth so desperately needs. An environment where ideas can be freely shared and tested and refined in a group without judgment, and then being able to benefit from the collective wisdom, the creativity of that community. And so that is essentially what I'm currently working on with Humble Mind, and I invite you to check it out on humblemind.co. And I really think that even though we looked at a kind of a deep dive there with history and the kinds of things that it can teach us about our current moment in our history right now, I really think that it does come down to that connection, being able to connect to each other and overcome the barriers of disconnection and overwhelm and distraction. Because as soon as we get better at learning how to connect with each other about the things that we care about in these smaller kind of micro-community type of groups, we really do begin to see positive things happen, change, inspiration. We get a better shot at being able to transform the journey that we're on and to take control of it and to hopefully steer ourselves and the role that we play on this planet into, or rather on a better course. So thanks for listening. I hope that this was an interesting deep dive for you into how the thinking for Humble Mind is taking shape and how I'm trying to realize the problem of helping people connect better and helping them to develop skills, the kinds of skills that not only will help them in their careers, in the way that they start new businesses and solve problems on a customer level, but really how they're part of a larger story. And it's the story of our own development, the story of our own history, and how we're helping people rethink how they learn and what they'll need in order to be ready for the future, whether they're starting new businesses or retraining themselves or shifting their behavior. It all comes down to the learning and the connecting. So thanks so much for jumping on the Humble Pie, for listening to this. I'll be releasing a couple more episodes in the next couple of weeks, just around Humble Mind and having some more of the facilitators join us and some more of the featured speakers. That's going to be really, really exciting. But until then, take care and thanks for listening.